Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Imaging Ambassador, and today I'd like to talk about software rather than Sony cameras or lenses. Now, I do get asked a lot of questions online about people finding noise and unacceptable noise in their images. So there are a couple of solutions to this, and one of these is software post-production. Now, we'll be looking at DxO Pure Raw 2. Now, I'll also be looking at Topaz D-Noise, but this is primarily about the DxO software. Now, you can purchase this online from DxO. It's $129 US. I will put a link in the info section below the movie if you want to use my referral to that software. Okay, so there are a couple of ways of avoiding doing noise reduction in software that you have to purchase. You probably already own a piece of software like Adobe Lightroom, and we can do some noise reduction here. Now, I never do high levels of noise reduction globally using Lightroom. What I'll often do is select the subject, invert the mask, and then apply noise reduction to the out of focus areas. Now, people are more aware of the noise in the bokeh or the defocused areas of the images than they are on the actual subject themselves. So if you do use the Lightroom's AI technologies to select subject and then invert the mask, you will basically be targeting that defocused or out of focus background. Now, Lightroom gets it right pretty much 9 times out of 10, so there's going to be very few instances where you have to do some manual masking using one of the brush tools there. Now, as well as ramping up the noise reduction, you could take it all of the way to plus 100 if it's just the bokeh or defocused areas you're denoising. But I also typically add some negative texture as well, just to smooth out so the bokeh doesn't get too patchy or blotchy in those areas. Now, there is better solutions, however, to doing the noise reduction in Lightroom. Now, on the left here, you can see this picture of this young kangaroo with no noise reduction. This was an image captured with the Alpha 7 IV at ISO 10,000. Now, if we take a look at the workflow that I just outlined using Lightroom, we can see that example in the middle. Now, if we go over to DxO Deep Raw 2, this is a processed raw file that we've done in DxO Deep Raw, and you can see the fine detail at the edges of the kangaroo, especially around the nose there. We do have a better outcome. Unfortunately, that heavy noise reduction into the bokeh areas has also attacked the fine whiskers, so you can get better results. If you were being fussy as well, if you look inside in amongst the fur, you will see that some of that noise at ISO 10,000 is visible, and we can see in the DxO Deep Raw version that some of that noise has been suppressed or reduced in those areas of fine detail as well. There is DxO Deep Raw 2 on the left, and another very fine piece of software for denoising the images is Topaz D-Noise Ai. Now, there is going to be some small differences in bokeh here. We can tend to get rid of all of the noise completely using the Topaz, but I find the bokeh or defocused areas perhaps a little bit more blotchy on the Topaz D-Noise Ai rather than the DxO Deep Raw 2. So we'll dive into the DxO Deep Raw 2 in a little bit more detail. Now, this one is processed from an Alpha 1 file at ISO 20,000. Now, if we take a look at the side-by-side comparison, I've zoomed into 100%, sorry, this is 50% magnification. With these very high resolution sensors, sometimes if we're not cropping, there isn't really a need to zoom to 100%, because no one everyone online is going to be zooming this far into the noise, and the more we zoom, the more we magnify that noise. So this is a 50% magnification of this Greyhound, and you can see what a fine job that DxO Pure Raw 2 has done. They actually call this algorithm Deep Prime on the latest Deep Raw 2, and you can see that's got a fine outcome there. Going into 100% this time, and of course not very many people will see the noise at this level of magnification unless you've cropped quite aggressively in post-production and then exporting a 4K image from that cropped version. This is the full size image, but I am zooming into 100% so you can see the protection of fine detail that the Deep Prime algorithms have done here on that Greyhound. I'm going to show you lots of examples, and I will give you a link to some ultra high definition images. I'm not here to sell the product specifically, and I don't expect you to take my word for the outcome here. I would much prefer that you go in to the ultra high definition images and take a look by zooming in on my Flickr Pro account so you can see the outcome for yourself. So this was a kookaburra captured in a dark rainforest at ISO 12,800, and if we look at the 100% magnification side by side, again you can see the noise suppression on the DxO version here. And again, this is going to be something that a lot of photographers are looking for, especially photographers who have been using very fast shutter speeds with elevated ISOs, such as bird photographers or sports photographers working in low ambient light, but also just working at the far ends of the day where there isn't any bright ambient light. And of course I'm working with a 400mm focal length. I've slowed the shutter speed down as far as I dare to 1/250th of a second here, handheld, and of course with the maximum aperture of f5.6 this has resulted in an ISO of 12,800. But of course with the post-production we can see that this is the outcome is more than acceptable. Even on a large 4K monitor we would be more than happy. Again in a dark rainforest at ISO 12,800, this time on an Alpha 1 camera, we can see the fine outcome of this in the 4K. If you're not already viewing this video tutorial in 4K, I would recommend that you do switch to viewing this in 4K on a larger monitor. Here is the magnification at 50%. 50% doesn't look too bad on this Alpha 1, even though it's 12,800. But again, if we had cropped in aggressively or we're doing a very large print, we can see that the advantage of processing the raw file through DxO Pure Raw 2. Here's a sporting image, a guy on a longboard at ISO 10,000, and again looking at 100%, you can see quite clearly in the smoother areas such as the guy's visor here how much that noise is perhaps becoming quite in your face here. But of course processing this image through Deep Prime algorithms, we can see that's cleaned it up really nicely here. Again, in a very dark rainforest, maximum aperture as slow as I dare go on the shutter speed, but already on this Alpha 1 image we've got up to ISO 8000, and if we look at the unprocessed image on the left, we can see how much that raw image is. Now again, this noise might only be this noticeable if we're doing a very large image or we have cropped in post. I haven't actually cropped in post on this one, but you can see certainly if we're zooming to 100% on a large monitor how prevalent that noise will appear. Now if we were doing noise reduction to the raw file in Lightroom and we weren't using the subject detection and then denoising the background, if we were just erasing the noise reduction slider and trying to hang on as much fine detail as possible, we can see the high levels of noise reduction in Lightroom start attacking the fine detail of this lizard here. So we can see processed version instead on the right, we're hanging on to all of that fine detail, and just look at the information around the eye, and we can see how much detail we're hanging on to in the scales in that process version through the deep prime algorithms. Here's another high action image here at ISO 8000. Again, we've elevated the shutter speed now to 1/2000th of a second, which will often push the ISO values much higher. We're into a fairly comfortable zone, I think, on an alpha 1, so long as we haven't cropped. But again, if we were to look at the raw file unprocessed, we can see the noise is starting to steal a little bit of the fine detail away. Now, we've held on to that fine detail in the process version on the right, but you can also see that fine detail is actually enhanced. The fur on this detail looks more detailed, in fact, just because of the absence of that noise. Again, another example. Now, often we can sort of sit with high ISO values, especially with black and white images. So the unprocessed version of this doesn't look that problematic at ISO 5000 on this, I think it's an alpha 9 image here. But again, looking at that, the skin textures, we can see the absence of that noise creates a smoother skin texture in the process version on the right here. Now again, this is the process version at ISO 5000. This is an older model DSLR camera, the Sony Alpha 99 camera here. And if we look at the unprocessed version, we can see what a good job, not only in noise reduction, but just almost intensifying the blacks or the shadow values here. So we certainly benefit from that processed version of this file. Again, ISO 4000, again on an older style camera, but we can see the processed version. Again, just around the eyes, we're getting the maximum benefit of that noise reduction, and we're getting a deeper contrast in and around the eyes there as well. Zooming into 100%, we can now quite clearly see that noise flowing across the eyeballs, which have that smoother surface. Again, you are going to be most aware of the noise over the smoother tones, and especially on the surface of that eye. This is where the noise starts to become quite problematic when we zoom into 100%. Now this is on an Alpha 7R4. This tends to be a stop behind the high ISO noise performance of other full frame Sony cameras. Now again, if in an uncropped image, I'm more than comfortable at ISO 2500, and I did outline in my Alpha 7R4 review the need to perhaps only zoom to 50% if you're not cropping the images, because the higher the resolution of the images, the more you're zooming in when you zoom to 100%. So you can be a little bit overcritical of the noise of a camera such as the Alpha 7R4. Now at that 50% zoom, even the unprocessed version, we're still, I think, quite comfortable here. But on that DxO Prime, we're cleaning out those smooth tones on the paintwork of the ship quite nicely here. Now again, just a reminder, the higher the resolution of the sensor, the more, when we export a 4K image, the more we're shrinking the noise. And you can see, compared to that 24 megapixel white frame there, how much more we're shrinking the noise of one of these 650 or 60 megapixel images. And we can see the that 4K darker grey oblong there, which is of course what we're shrinking down to for display on a 4K monitor. You can zoom into 100% and start to see that noise becoming problematic, but to be honest, on an Alpha 7R4 file, you'd have to be printing very large prints if you hadn't cropped aggressively in post-production in order to be able to see that noise. And I'm talking prints perhaps wider than 3 feet in length, so you could see that noise. Now, some people will zoom even further to 200%, and I really don't recommend zooming in, because things can start to look quite ugly quite quickly. But how much they will tighten up if we're just zooming to 50 or 100%. But again, on the cleaned up version on that DxO Deep Prime, we can see how well that software is doing. Now there are two algorithms that the Pure Raw offers, and that is prime and deep prime. Here we're looking at the deep prime version on the left here. And here again, looking alongside just the prime version. Again, you do get the option of running it through prime or deep prime, but I found that the deep prime, especially if you just like a little bit sharper images with a little bit more localized contrast, I think most people will elect to use the deep prime version. Getting a little bit of a color shift between the two algorithms, and of course we could just correct that in the white balance settings, and I'll be looking at this topic in a little bit more detail a little bit later as well. More examples: IS 2000 again in a rainforest, 50%. It doesn't look that too bad on the left, but again if we zoom to 100% we can start to see the noise in the darker feathers. Often the noise can look more problematic in very dark shadows, especially if we've lightened them up in post-production editing. The noise can be enhanced by lightening dark shadows, especially at the higher ISO values. APS-C cameras are often more prone to noise when we're using the high ISO values. Here we've got APS-C mode on an Alpha 7.4 camera at ISO 2500. Effectively, if we're using APS-C mode on a full frame camera, we're just magnifying that noise a little bit more than had we been able to zoom in with a longer focal length lens. So here looking at the 50% magnification, again cleaning up really nicely. This is actually on an Alpha APS-C camera, and this is the Alpha 6000, and this is 6400. For many people this would be outside of their comfort zone on one of the APS-C cameras, so you can see how you can work with higher ISO values than you would typically want to do. I have known people lower the ISO auto range, but of course then we're at danger of using shutter speeds too slow and invoking either camera shake or subject blur by doing that. So I think the ability to work at these higher ISO values with shutter speeds, and you can see that I haven't been working with a shutter speed that's too fast really. I've managed to slow this down to 1/15th of a second in order to pull that ISO 6400, and I'm working with the maximum f4 aperture. So had I not done that, the ISO values would be even higher. But again, we can see in DxO Deep Prime how well that has been produced from this image. We're looking now at an Alpha 6400 camera at 6400 ISO, and again there's the 100%. Especially those skin tones can look quite noisy because they are smoother tones. So as well as the bokeh areas, we also can see noise in smoother tones such as skin. So we can see how that has cleaned up quite nicely in the processed image. Again, an Alpha 6600 camera this time at ISO 2000, and again before and after versions side by side in Lightroom. Bird photography again on the Alpha 6600 camera, pushing the ISO to 1/2000th of a second, which even in the bright conditions has raised the ISO to 1250. And again we can see that 100% magnification side by side in the unprocessed and processed versions. Sporting images again on the APS-C cameras. As soon as we hit the 2000, many APS-C users will be looking quite heavily at the noise. Again, looking at around the glasses and nose, you can see how well that is cleaned up in the process version on the right there. Again, reducing the size of the sensor often makes noise more problematic. I will often work with a small RX100 pocket camera. These use what's called 1-inch sensors, which are significantly smaller than the APS-C cameras. And we're working at really high ISO for a 1-inch sensor here, ISO 6400, and if we look at that 50% magnification, you can see the noise is slightly problematic, and of course at 100% the noise is really quite problematic. And again, how well that has cleaned up in the DxO Deep Prime processed version. Again, this is almost a nighttime shot of these fishermen gathered around a campfire on a beach here. There's a tiny little bit of light at the first light of day here, but we're well away from sunrise here. So this would normally be out of territory for a small pocket camera, but again, it's cleaned up really nicely in the DxO Prime software here. Again, in the skin tones on the hand, the face, and also in the blue sky in the background, you can see how nicely this is cleaned up. Working with sporting images with the RX107, slowed the shutter speed down as much as I dare here in order to get some movement blur, but also to keep the ISO low. And even though the ISO is quite low on the RX100 now, because I've been lightening the shadows, it has certainly cleaned up the RX100 image just a little bit more, and the image just also benefits from looking just a little bit sharper here. Now when we start processing images in DxO, we can right click on images inside of Lightroom to process them, or we can use the DxO standalone software to process our raw images. Now one of the things that you'll be invited to do is when you first start working with DxO Pure Raw, is you'll be invited to download a profile for your camera lens combination. Sometimes if you've been working with an atypical lens, it might give you choices, so you do have to look quite carefully at the options here. So it wasn't super sure which lens I had actually used, but once you've selected the correct option, you can then click download selection before proceeding to process the images. Here I'm processing 42 raw images, and you can see on my M1 Mac here it's going to take about 8 minutes to process these 42. Now you might be working with a slower or faster processor on your computer, so you might be able to do this in less time, but if you're working with an older laptop, it might take significantly longer as well. You will be given new raw files. They're not processed JPEGs. You are given the option to have a raw outcome to the processing, and your unprocessed original raw files will be retained. So it's not a destructive workflow by any means. If for any reason you don't like the processed version, you still have your original version unprocessed. Now there are options, of course, when you're processing to export from Lightroom through DxO. I will often just access this by right-clicking on a bunch of thumbnails in the grid view of Lightroom. I don't work with this export workflow, but this is another option, so you can be processing in the background. Now the other things you'll be given is you'll be given the prime or deep prime algorithms, and I looked at my preference there, which was for deep prime. You also get the DxO optical corrections for global lens sharpening and also lens distortion corrections. Those are options you can disable if you don't want the sharpening or you don't want the lens corrections to take place, and then you'll simply hit that process button in the bottom right hand side of that dialog to start the processing workflow. Now I processed quite a number of files from different cameras using different lenses, and I did hit one of my lenses that wasn't supported with a profile here, and that is my Sony FE 400mm f2.8 G Master Prime. Now it didn't recognize the lens at all, and so it was offering a Sony A9 with a Canon 400mm prime, and that one is a lens that I don't own. So I checked the none of the above and then went through to processing without the lens profile being applied. Okay, so that is something that you might hit occasionally. Again, this is basically how I accessed my processing from Lightroom. I don't have to use the standalone software. I'll just right click and then choose to process with DxO Pure Raw, which will be one of the export options. Now, the Lightroom edits are retained if I'm processing a Dng file in Lightroom rather than the Sony ARW file. So I won't have to reprocess the file if I'd already done all of my Lightroom editing in the develop module. So that is a useful tip there. If you don't want to do that, I would convert the ARW file to a Dng file before processing to Pure Raw 2. And there's a 100% comparison between this running dog shot here. Now I just wanted to highlight some of the things that happen when processing a Dng file. So this is a bird image captured with the Alpha 6600, and I've gone in and I've chosen process with DxO Pure Raw 2. Now if we look at the processed version, we do have all of the editing applied to the processed version here, except if we go to the detail tab and also the lens corrections tab, we'll see those are zeroed out because the DxO Prime has done some sharpening for us. That was one of the options, and I left the sharpening on. So basically it's removed any post-processing sharpening I'd done to the original Dng file. And you can also see that if I'd done any noise reduction, including color noise reduction, those are also zeroed out. So and again, if we look at the lens profile, DxO has applied its own lens profile, which we often invited to download, and those have also been removed from the processed version. One of the downsides I notice with the DxO Pure Raw is occasionally we do get a color shift, and sometimes the color shift isn't very minor. In this one you can see that the processed version is a lot warmer, so we would have to go in and correct that white balance. And this is even though I was processing a Dng file with a custom white balance, it actually hasn't picked that up, or there is a slight shift in colors from the DxO Raw process version. Here's the process version, and we can see that I definitely do want to process some of these high ISO shots at a nighttime event at the Greyhound Racing. And again, another version at ISO 5000. You can see how well these are cleaning up. Now this is one of those instances where I wasn't entirely happy with the process. 99% of the time I was happy. This was an image captured at ISO 51200, and we can see on the forehead of this girl, and she's actually only being illuminated by the light coming from her smartphone here, but we can see the little bit of over sharpening that is being applied to that forehead. It's smoothed out the cheek and the chin quite nicely, but it's sort of over sharpened the detail. It didn't really understand whether that was noise or fine detail it should protect and preserve. So we can of course disable that global lens sharpening, but I found that even with that done, I still found that there was a few artifacts on the forehead even though I disabled that global lens sharpening. So I just wanted to show you, coming back to Topaz D-Noise, there are a few more options in Topaz D-Noise to control how much sharpening gets applied and where noise also gets applied, because we do have masking options. Now things pretty much are an all or nothing in the Pure Raw, DxO Pure Raw, where we do get some more localized options in software such as Topaz D-Noise, such as the masking here, where I can decide how much noise reduction gets applied and where that noise reduction gets applied to my images. So again, coming back to a side-by-side comparison, I think both of these softwares are really good at noise reduction. You will pick small differences, as I've said. In this instance, I've ramped up the noise reduction even higher on Topaz, so that bokeh is absolutely liquid clean here. There is a very small amount of noise. This is 100% magnification here, so I certainly wouldn't be overcritical of the deep raw noise reduction in this instance. Perhaps where the I do fall in favor of the DxO is the bokeh can look a little bit smoother, less patchy than in Topaz D-Noise. So that is one of the benefits. Here's another one of the ones where I actually felt that Topaz D-Noise was going to do a better job. We can see again it's a slightly problematic image. There's rain falling at this Superbike championship here, and the camera isn't too sure what is noise and what is rain that's falling, and so there is a slight problem in how it's handling that rain in the processed version on the right. I also get a sense that it's not as sharp as the unprocessed version, even though sharpening was selected. And again, in Topaz D-Noise, because we can control the noise reduction and the sharpening using the masking controls and also additional sliders, I did think that we could get a slightly better outcome with the Topaz D-Noise. As I said, the deep raw is doing a great job, but there is those 5% of shots where if you do own Topaz D-Noise as well, you may be interested in just processing that a second time using the alternative software. Take a look at Pure Raw 2 and follow the link in the info below that, and if you're interested in purchasing DxO Pure Raw 2. Now, for those who are Sony Alpha users, just a reminder that I do create these 400 and 500 page ebooks that if you join me on patreon.com/Mark Gaylor, you can download these as part of your membership, and as well as the ebooks, there's Q&A forums, member-only seminars. I do provide raw files for new camera and lens reviews, and I also supply cam set files to set up some of the late model alpha cameras from a file just copied to a memory card. So there's the outline of everything that is on offer at patreon.com/Mark Gaylor, and those are just some of the many seminar archives that I've got that you can watch. In fact, there's over 20 hours of member-only seminars that you can watch and ask questions about in the forums below. So that concludes my DxO Pure Raw 2 software review. I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Imaging Ambassador.